Let's see now the attendees coming. Hello, everyone.
Hello.
Hello.
And we're recording. So give it some seconds more because I see the number of attendees is still rising. Hello, everyone again.
Hello.
I think when we reach 35, 40, I'm going to start introducing the seminar and every one of you. Yes, I think it's okay. We can start. So hello, everyone. On behalf of Transform Europe, I would like to welcome you in our first webinar. It's a premiere for us. We try to do our best to make sure that the technology will assist us in what we're doing today. Thank you very much for taking the time to be with us. And I would like to introduce to you the 5 people you see now on your screens. And myself, my name is Katerina Anastasiou, and I'm responsible for the Transform programs that are related to migration and global strategy. This is my colleague, Barbara Steiner. She's our director, and she's thankfully helping us today and moderating the chat in which all of you can write. And my other colleague, Tania Moutinho from Porto, she will be joining us and helping us moderating the Q&A box. Now, a reminder before we start with our discussion, there is an extra Q&A box under your video summary. This is where you should pose your questions. Questions that are on the chat might get out of our attention and we will not be able to take them into consideration. So please use the Q&A box. Regarding today, we will begin by giving some time to Gabriel and to Iasonas to start by explaining the situation. Iasonas will go first. Each one of them will have about 10 minutes to give us the first overview. And then I will continue by posing questions and moderating the discussion, also in accordance to what we hear from you, particularly the public questions, the questions coming from you. We're gonna start answering them approximately at 6 o'clock if our program works out. Everybody that is not speaking is gonna be muting their mic. This is also the case for me, so don't expect to have an immediate response. Thank you very much again for being here. And Iasonas, if you would start, we would be very thankful.
Hello from me, and thank you for the invitation. So I will try to summarize the current refugee situation in Greece and explain the big changes that have occurred over the last month, starting with maybe the most important event, the emergency decree that was approved by the Greek government. So on March 3rd, during the first days of the events at Evros border, where thousands of refugees were gathered to seek asylum in Europe, the Greek government issued a special decree. They suspended the right to apply for asylum for a month, and they decided to carry out immediate mass deportations. This applies for every person, every migrant who crosses the land or the sea borders from the 1st of March onward. That means practically that in Lesbos, in Evros, in Samos, anywhere in Greece, it's very difficult to approach the incoming refugees anymore. They are all considered prisoners of the state. They are not subjected to international law or to the Geneva Convention anymore. They don't have access to asylum procedures or even sometimes to normal legal support. The procedure is very specific. As soon as the people arrive at the coast or at the land border, they are arrested by the police. They are kept in separate places, and then they are distributed in prisons around Greece with the aim to be deported back to their countries. Everybody is subjected to the same treatment. There is no distinction, consideration between vulnerabilities, women, children, families, etc. For example, at Evros, some of the first people who arrived including unaccompanied children. They were captured by the police and we didn't know where they were. The lawyers were looking for them for days and couldn't find them. Then we learned that they were already arrested and jailed for illegal entry. And some of them, they were condemned up to 5 years in jail without suspension. We have a lot of reports from the Evros region, even from journalists from the CNN, that Greek police or Greek paramilitary groups, they are patrolling along the borderline. Sometimes they act like mafia gangs. They torture, they capture refugees who are never seen again. We know that so far 2 people for sure were shot dead by the Greek fire, 2 men, 1 Syrian and 1 Pakistani. The Pakistani was Mohammed Gulsar, because I'm referring to his name especially because he was a person who has lived for a period of time in the squad of City Plaza in Athens. It's a squad of City Plaza was an important center of the solidarity movement to refugees and migrants. We also know that several other people who entered the border of Evros have been tortured, stripped of their clothes, blindfolded and forcibly deported to Turkey in secret operations during the night. It's a well-known tactic since years. We have a lot of testimonies regarding that the Greek forces put them on a boat and then they forced them to cross the river Evros, the border between Greece and Turkey. For this purpose, the Greek government, they set up a secret detention center at Evros border in a very remote area. It's like a black site. Nobody exactly knows what's going on in there. The location was revealed by New York Times using satellite image. And again, from testimonies from refugees who were detained, beaten, and then expelled from Greece. It's a center where people are subjected to brutal violence. No law is applied, no human rights, no protection. It's like a Guantanamo in Europe. And the Greek government hasn't denied the existence of this center. So the same procedure applies more or less on the Greek islands. In Lesbos, the 650 refugees who arrived over the first 3 weeks of March, they were kept inside a military ship at the harbor of Mytilene. They were not taken to Moria because they are not allowed to apply for asylum anymore. And after 2 weeks, they were distributed to 2 different prisons in Greece, one of which was built only for this purpose. It is actually not a prison, it's a closed camp with tents in a remote rural area on the north of Greece. So in theory, this decree expires tomorrow. Initially, it was meant to be only for 1 month, but we are sure that they will extend it because they want to prevent another Evros event. And as I was reading today, all the major people of position from the islands, they are supporting the idea of extending this decree. They say it's very successful, the arrivals have decreased, etc. So even though we all understand that this is it's a huge violation of international law, actually it's an abolition of the Geneva Convention in its very sense, the Convention for the Status of Refugees. The European Union supported Greece in this decision, the same way they supported Italy when Salvini closed the harbors to all rescue ships with another presidential decree, the same way, again, which entailed another huge violation of international law and human rights. I'm referring to Salvini in Italy because the last 3 years I'm involved in teams, in rescue teams, operating in the central Mediterranean Sea, rescuing migrants who flee from Libya. So the narrative of Europe is constructed in a way that says, okay, what you are doing with the asylum procedure is not very good, but we understand the migration problem. Every country has the right to defend its borders and all these things. Of course, it's obvious that Greece at the moment is doing the dirty job for all Europe. They are blocking one main entry point to Europe, and they are providing a high level of anti-immigration service on behalf of other countries. At the same time, they're raising the level of violence against unarmed men, women, and children. And we have seen in the past that these methods can be used as part of the European policy of the border policy of Fortress Europe to deter people from coming. The policy of making the lives of refugees as horrible as it gets, to keep them vulnerable and exploitable and discourage the rest from coming to Europe. The other major thing is the change in the public discourse. So the refugees are no longer the war-torn people who seek protection and safety on European soil, because this narrative, it's something we all agree, and it was quite strong in Greece in the crisis of 2015, 2016. But now they are seen as an instrument, as a tool of Erdogan, of the enemy Erdogan. Many people in Greece see the Evros event as a Turkish-backed invasion. So for them, there is no refugee problem anymore. Even though Turkey has 4 million refugees, there is no problem. Like Italy, for example, was blaming the rescue ships for being the pull factor of migration. Now Greece is blaming Turkey for being the push factor of migration. And this narrative has fueled an extreme level of hatred throughout the Greek society. A lot of nationalist and racist groups took to the streets and started patrolling along the borderline, attacking NGO workers, journalists, and volunteers, creating a state of terror. They prevented boats from landing, they hindered assistance to refugees, they burned down reception centers and solidarity structures for migrants. Many of my local friends in Lesbos, they were telling me that it's the first time that they're afraid for their lives. In Skalasi Kaminias, a quite famous village in Lesbos, it's the place where, it's a village that was nominated for the Nobel Prize, the Peace Nobel Prize. Racist groups, they burned down a refugee camp, the camp of the United Nations, actually, the camp of UNHCR, and they did it in front of the police. So the police was present during the attack at the camp and did nothing. And this is the biggest problem that we are facing on the ground. This combined effort of the police and the local racists to intimidate and scare the people of solidarity of the island. Right now, solidarity items is like carrying drugs or weapons. I mean, local people told me that if they want to help refugees who arrive at the coasts of the island, they are hiding the blankets and the sleeping bags in the car, not to give target to the racist groups. Otherwise, they might break your car or injure you. So in the Aegean Sea, the Greek Coast Guard, they set up a huge no-go zone where access was forbidden to every private ship, and it's still forbidden. It's a huge zone from Lesbos up to Samos, so the NGOs could not operate anymore at sea. So no rescues by the civil society fleet, no witnesses, no reports, no monitoring, nothing. One rescue ship, Mare Liberum, was attacked by local groups, and the ship had to flee in the open sea, and they were stranded there. For 8 days, the Greek authorities didn't give them permission to dock. They were at anchor offshore. A situation like closed harbors, like again Italy of Salvini. From the land, observing from the land, witnesses have seen at least 15 violent pushbacks committed by the Greek Coast Guard in Lesbos. I'm sure everybody has watched the video where the Greek Coast Guard is creating waves to sink refugee boats. Then they shoot just in front of them, and then they beat the refugees up with sticks. Similar incidents have been occurring every day over the last month. On March 2nd, on the 2nd of March, one 6-year-old child drowned after a suspicious shipwreck, which occurred minutes after the Greek Coast Guard intervened. And officially, the Greek government declared that they did 45 pushbacks. It's crazy. 45 pushbacks. They talk about pushbacks as if it is something legal and appropriate to do so. Europe is supporting Greece 100% in these actions, in these atrocities. We have a British Frontex vessel, Valiant, which is present in Lesbos, and it was seen to take part in these actions. One clarification for those who don't know the geography, there is no international waters in this part of the Aegean Sea. It's either Turkish waters, territorial waters, or Greek. So a boat will either be on the Greek side or on the Turkish side. And by the maritime law, by default, all the migrant boats are boats in distress, are boats in danger. And distress is not only when the boat is sinking. Distress is because they're overcrowded, they are rubber dinghies of extremely low quality, nobody's wearing a life jacket, they have no navigation or communication equipment, they can collapse at any time. So the only action that the Coast Guard is allowed to do is rescue, nothing else. Abandoning people in distress, or even worse, forcing them to change their course, to go back to Turkey, is a crime, and it's an action that can lead to mass death. It's like an attempt to mass killing. As we said before, all the refugees who managed to pierce the blockade of the Coast Guard ships and arrive at the Greek shores, they are not taken to Moria, since they are not allowed to apply for asylum anymore. But instead, they are taken to a military ship at the harbor of Mytilene, where they stay for weeks in horrible conditions. So we have migrants stranded at sea, we have rescuers stranded at sea, we have criminalization of solidarity, and it's true, it's a hard moment, hard period, and a very difficult context for the solidarity movement to operate. And now it's becoming even more difficult with the coronavirus measures.
Yeah, Sona, I will ask you to put a pause here so we can listen to Gabriel, and then we will engage in the discussion with more detail in this.
Okay.
Just before, also because some people just joined us, to put the context again. Migrants and refugees in Greece, but also at the Greek-Turkish border, have been under enormous stress long before the coronavirus became a pandemic, long before. I mean, in the times we live in, 2 weeks is long before. And there has been extreme tension on Turkey, which means right now in Greece, we have a double unfolding crisis. Just to put everything in context. Gabriel, it's your turn, and then we enter the discussion. You are muted, Gabriel. We have to, something is not working with your microphone. We cannot hear you. Now we can hear you again.
Are you sure? Okay.
Yes.
Okay, great. Thanks. You didn't miss anything. I was just thanking you for this kind invitation. You, the people, you, Katerina, and the people from Transform, because it's very crucial in these days of quarantine, while we are all remain at our houses. It's very important not to stop discussing on these very crucial issues that have to do with human rights. And it is true that this new reality that has been formed throughout the last weeks in various ways, not only the COVID, but all the things that Iason has mentioned before, have created a very, very serious situation for human rights in the Greek islands. I will try to restrain myself to a little bit to the issue of COVID-19 and refugees. Because first of all, Iasonas was he gave a very good overview of the situation, and I have nothing, I mean, there are always things to add, but he gave a very good presentation of the situation. So I will try to restrain myself a bit to the case of COVID and refugees. So as if we don't have a lot of problems, and there were not problems especially in the Greek islands, right now in the middle of the pandemic, we have to face a pretty new situation, a situation that actually mutates week by week or even day by day. First of all, let's think that it is important to have in mind what we say to the people during the pandemic, that we are giving people are given some instructions in order to stay in distant by other people, to sanitate themselves, to wash themselves, to stay home, etc. Obviously, all these instructions don't work very well when for people who are homeless, for people who don't have access to water, who don't have access to preventive measures as masks and sanitizers and all that. All these above apply obviously for the asylum seekers, refugees and migrants in Greece who are currently living in overcrowded accommodation facilities in the camps on the Greek islands. In the camps of the islands in Lesbos, Chios, Samos, Leros, and Kos, who are systematically overcrowded. Right now, approximately live about 37,000 people, while the official capacity of these facilities is a little bit over 6,000, if you can imagine the numbers and make the comparison. As a result, people live in close contact with each other, both in open spaces and in their accommodations. Just to give you an idea, I'm sure that you have seen the pictures, but it's important to say a few things. Accommodation in camps actually consist of tents or makeshift sheds, totally unsuitable for winter conditions, and there is no running water or heating. And with the state of this constant overcrowding, many thousands of refugees and asylum seekers live outside the formal premises of the camps. So in these cases, there is even more limited access to services. What we see in the islands is people queuing at water distribution points in order to get some drinking water for themselves and their families. In the Olive Grove in Moria, which is the informal accommodation center outside the camp, people rely on one communal fountain to access water for personal use and for drinking. And the same a little bit holds for Samos, which is also a very difficult situation, where people are queuing and are struggling day by day, not only today in this COVID-19 era, but even before that, to find some water for themselves and their families. What it is obvious is that all this overcrowded accommodation, coupled with the limited access to water and sanitation in the camps in Greece, is creating serious challenges for people to follow advices that is currently being given to prevent exposure to COVID-19. And they will find it hard or even impossible to practice social distancing. It's a joke, actually, or to wash their hands regularly, as they say. And this the people in these camps are already at risk of other health conditions. It's not only COVID. There are many incidents of people with a lot of problems with skin conditions, which are very common among people living in the camps due to the limited availability of sanitation facilities. And they are exposed to cold during the winter and to rain. And this is very important, especially for people with prior respiratory conditions who appear to be at greater risk of severe impact if they get COVID-19. Just to give you, however, an idea of the Greek healthcare system, especially in the islands, the healthcare system in Greece is under strains as a result, obviously, of the austerity measures and all the crisis situation that started in Greece in about 2009, 2010. The effect, the impact of this crisis and the austerity that came after it actually is very obvious in terms of the welfare state and especially in the healthcare system. And in the islands, there were significant problems, and there would be significant problems even before the issue with the refugees and even before COVID-19. Provision of specialized medical services in hotspots on the islands has been limited because of a lot of factors, including hiring freezes and other administrative issues. And as a result, refugees and asylum seekers normally rely on voluntary services of medical NGOs and on the already strained public services on the islands, which have long been struggling to meet the needs of their patients. Without substantial changes in the provision of services in camps to put in place a response to COVID-19, these already scarce services risk to be put under further strain. In addition, and this is also important, since July 2019, in the summer, new asylum seekers in the country have in practice been denied access to the free healthcare in the public system. This is the result of their exclusion from social security numbers, which previously was granted to them and out of a law that passed in 2016. And this is also a very big issue and creates very important implications on the access to the right to health for these people, which is a social right that is recognized by international conventions on economic and social rights and in the Declaration of in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and in every international standard for human rights. So, in order to make the long story short, if I can, what we do as Amnesty International, and not only us, obviously, but a lot of human rights organizations in Greece and international organizations as well. What we are asking, what we are calling Greece to do is to protect people in the camps and in other facilities across Greece from any hate and risk to their health or welfare, to reduce their exposure to these risks and provide a clear plan on how to mitigate risks in practice. At the same time, we are calling the Greek government to ensure that asylum seekers have prompt access to treatment and care when is needed, And this includes actually improving living conditions and access to water and sanitation facilities. And where it's necessary, the Greek government should request, where it's necessary, actually, the Greek government should do all these things. Moreover, in its response to COVID-19, what we are calling the Greek government is to refrain from introducing arbitrary restrictions on refugees, asylum seekers, and migrants. As such, as Iason has mentioned before, we ask from the Greek government to restore the right to seek asylum in the country, which has been temporarily suspended for a month since March 1st, 2020, and ensure that measures such as restrictions on travel and travel bans are applied in a manner consistent with the protection of the right to seek asylum and the principle of non-refoulement. Moreover, the Greek government ensure that these restrictions that are permissible and in cases of pandemic on the freedom of movement, as they apply to asylum seekers, refugees, and migrants, is provided by law and necessary to protect public health. And when imposed, however, this should be short and in any case be temporary, and they should be monitored in short periods in order to see if there is still any reason to implement them. The announcements that are currently being made by the Greek authorities, this is the very problematic, about potential restrictions on the movements of refugees in existing camps or their transfer to new closed facilities, are a very big problem right now, because as Iason has mentioned before, they are actually based on a toxic climate of both rhetorics but also of policy that we see. And all these proposed new closed camps present potential risks, as many of them are planned to be set in isolated locations where access to services, of course, won't be possible. And it also appears that they do not have this sufficient capacity to host refugee population in the islands. And all these things we have denounced in the past before the COVID crisis, and obviously under the COVID and the pandemic, we stress even more the importance of the government to set back, to take back all these measures that they have proposed. What is really important is to urgently increase transfer from the islands to adequate facilities on the mainland, and which is something that we ask for a long time, and we have been criticized the EU-Turkey deal that actually prohibits that from taking place. And moreover, we know very well that this situation actually reflects the total failure of the EU migration policy, which is mostly reflected out of the EU-Turkey deal. And every one of the events that we have seen throughout the last months is a piece of the puzzle, where the puzzle is the EU migration policy. So this failure actually reflects not the incapacity, but actually the refusal from the side of EU authorities or from the side of European governments to take up their responsibilities towards international human rights law and refugee law, and try to create a front yard in Greece, as they do actually in Italy, by in order to not to have refugees and migrants in European countries. What we say that is very much needed is actually a total reformation of the Dublin regulation, and its replacement actually from a mandatory mechanism that shares the responsibility to all member states in an equal proportionate way. That's all. I don't know if I spoke very much. I tried to
You're on time. Thank you very
I'm
much.
on time. So yes, that's all. I
Thank you very much.
more or less.
Thank you very much also for your important insights. I would like to proceed a little bit by asking a little bit more particular questions addressed to both of you, perhaps putting everything in context again, something that some of you may have not read already, but in Austria, at least it became, where I'm based, it became quite a big issue because Gerald Knaus, who is seen as one of the architects of the EU-Turkey deal 2016, before it was implemented, he was the person you would see in all the news panels defending this, this kind of deal. He gave an interview 3 days ago in an Austrian newspaper saying that more or less keeping the camps like Moria the way they are now is not only a danger for the refugees and migrants living in them, but also for the local populations. And why I think this is important, because we have to understand also after hearing you two that everything that we are forced to do right now, staying at home, again, washing ourselves, being extra careful with our hygiene, and so listening, even hearing to the instructions of the state, it's something that the people that are in the camps have not access to. Hygiene and medical care, as well as legal care, was never working the way it's supposed to work in Moria and in most of the Greek camps. But of course, during this COVID crisis, the situation is deteriorating. Perhaps for the next question, I can pick up I can pick up something that happened and has to do with the way this crisis has been communicated in the last years and the last weeks. Consequently, we saw, I don't remember the date exactly, but I guess it was around the 10th of March, the commissioner, van der Leyen, flying with a helicopter over the borders, more or less visiting the territory where the invasion is taking place. And particularly on social media, a lot of, let's say, politicians of the conservative center pretty much adopted this narration that Europe is being invaded and that we have to shield Europe against this invasion. The wording of shielding was very present, prompting a lot of NGOs and human rights organizations in Europe to create also monitoring structures to shield migrants from direct violations of their own rights. So what I'm sure is very quite interesting for our audience, and perhaps both of you can answer, is regarding the restriction measures that are applied now in Greece towards everyone living in Greece. Are there some extra measures applied to the camps? I'm sure you know more than our audience, meaning now I have heard that in Moria, for example, there are particular curfew times, that people from the camp are only allowed in particular time zones to visit the village, that there are thoughts of creating shops within the camps and also medical care within the camps. Could you wrap this up for us and for our viewers? Sorry, Gabriel, you can start, and maybe Yasonas, or Yasonas?
But I don't know if Gabriel wants to start first. It's okay. I mean,
Go ahead, Yasonas. I will
okay.
take a break.
Okay. Yeah. So the general description is that, regarding the Greek hotspots on the islands, is that the refugees are kind of abandoned in their own fate. For example, there are many agencies, state agencies, that are not operating, or they're semi-operating. Many services are partially shut down because of the coronavirus spread, like the agency of the unaccompanied minors, for example. And as we mentioned before, after the series of attacks against the NGO workers, many aid groups evacuated their staff from the islands. And now it's even worse because there are more coronavirus restrictions. So most of the NGO staff, those who have left on the ground, are forced to work from their houses. They're not allowed to enter inside the camp in the name of public health protection. So everything is understaffed, and many things are not working like before. Some of the measures, as you mentioned, Katerina, is that they imposed a curfew from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. So they're trying to keep the people inside. They have imposed movement restrictions. To be more precise, only one person per family is allowed to move in and out of the camp. But since this is very difficult to control it, they allow only 100 people to exit the camp at the same time. Like 100 people in smaller teams of 10. So the rest of the people who want to go to the town to buy stuff or to shop, they have to wait until the others return. Otherwise, they're not allowed to leave. That means that approximately only one person in 20 can leave each day. If we count that Moria is around, if we estimate that Moria is around 23,000 people and 100 people per hour, let's say, it's something like that. Also, the allowance, the 90 euros allowance from the UNHCR has been suspended. It's another measure to prevent.
I'm going to interrupt you with this because I am particularly curious as well. Has there been any, has the UNHCR take position on this? Could you tell us if you know?
I'm not aware of any position regarding the UNHCR, but I know that they're planning to build now the ATMs, to install the ATMs inside the camps. That's what they say, that we are, the work is progressing. Because another interesting fact is that they already installed one container inside Moria the last days to identify potential coronavirus cases. And they also set up some tents for isolation. To be honest, I have no idea how they will identify the cases, since the Greek system ran out of tests. They have no tests. Right now, they're not testing anybody who arrives on the shores of Lesbos, even if they have fever. There is no protective equipment. They have no masks. You know how Moria is like. It's like a jungle with tents next to each other. And imagine if Greek citizens are dying inside their houses, alone and helpless, because we had cases where people died because they didn't know that they were infected by the coronavirus. Imagine what will happen in Moria under these conditions.
Yeah, it's very difficult to imagine this right now, indeed. There have been calls. There have been, the Doctors Without Borders have been actually demanding and advising the evacuation of the camps since the 13th of March, as far as I'm informed. And it seems that the medical community is quite agreeing on this, that there is no way, in the conditions the way they are now, at least in these closed camps on the islands, there is no other way to avoid mass contagion. How do you see this? I mean, we've seen NGOs from all around Europe demanding, for example, the evacuation of children and women. Or I have seen a call from a quite big German NGO asking to bring boats to evacuate the people from the camps. How do you see all this? Do you think that the reason that no evacuation is happening has to do with limited resources of the Greek government, or is it rather political will, or can we hope that at least some kind of help will come for these people?
Okay, thank you, Katerina, for the question. Yeah, in my point of view, it's purely an issue of political unwillingness from the side of the Greek government, and that's actually just to give you an idea. First of all, this kind of policy is based actually on a dead EU-Turkey deal, because right now the EU-Turkey deal does not operate at all, and the only thing that is alive in order to remind us the EU-Turkey deal is this geographical restriction of the people in the islands, meaning that they are not allowed to move in the mainland in Greece. The reason behind that, and this is the rationale behind that, when the EU-Turkey deal took place in March 2016, was that the European government believed that if these people were finding their ways to the Greek mainland, they would also find ways to move to the other European countries. This is something that we have been told a lot of times from ambassadors here from European Union countries when we were advocating against this geographical restriction. And we have this kind of blunt answers that if these people will go to the mainland, they will eventually go to Europe. And at the same time that this is, that will be a pull factor for more people to come from the Turkish coastline. So as it seems right now, since we have reached a very, very difficult situation after July 2019, when we have an unprecedented situation with 40,000 people in the Greek islands, it seems that it's totally unsustainable to not to move people to the mainland. The reason that the Greek government did not take any initiative, of course, they are moving some people because in order to handle a little bit the inflows and the outflows, they are trying to manage the situation, but they are trying to manage the situation in a totally unsustainable way. And the reason is mostly political, because they understand that if they have to transfer the people in the mainland, there will be reactions in other cities, towns in the mainland, and as there already have been this kind of reactions, so it's difficult for the government to receive the political cost. So we are actually in a limbo situation where nobody is taking the initiative in order to improve the situation that has reached a dead end. At the same time, there is a stance from the side of the European Union, which is hypocritical. Yes, it's totally hypocritical, because on the one hand you see and you read that some sensitive voices, some sensitive declarations about the need to respect human rights. At the same time, they are not accompanied by measures from the side of the authorities. And this is something that is very, very problematic. It is important to say that, especially for the COVID era, 1 week ago, there was also a statement by the side of the European Commissioner on Interior Issues, the Swedish Johansson, I think is the commissioner, who was in Greece 2 or 3 weeks ago. And she also asked from the Greek government to move people to the mainland in order to face the COVID threat in the islands. And the answer from the side of the Greek government was that this is something that could not take place because it would be risky for the public health to transfer now in the within the pandemic these populations to another place. So it is true what Yasona said. There is a black box right now in the islands about the situation. The only information that we are receiving is from people working in the field, on the ground, especially from NGOs and people from the solidarity movement over there. Whereas it seems right now it is a situation that actually in the everyday aspect of the life is not very different from the previous week, which is also very worrying if you think about it. That people obviously are outside, they are very close to each other, which is very natural. The children are playing all around, and people with vulnerabilities are also exposed to the same risks as they were before, plus now they have to face the threat of COVID. As for now, there have not been any incidents referred in the refugee population in the islands. To be honest, it's not clear. As Yasona said before, in Greece, they are not using tests for the wide population as well. So it's not very easy to confirm if, for example, if I had fever, for example, I wouldn't know if that was COVID or a simple cold. So even if for the general population, it's not easy to confirm if you have COVID or not, then imagine about refugees. So yes, it's difficult. It's a very difficult situation. And what I would ask, if I can say it now, if what people can do is, I think it's really important because here in Greece, we are all trying in various channels, either from the NGO side or from the political level or from the people of solidarity and the movements to press for a different direction. It's really important to understand that the center of power for all these policies resides in Brussels, in the European Union, and not simply in European Union, but mostly in the big capitals of Europe, which are actually taking the decisions. So if you would like to do something and put pressure, then putting pressure to the governments in Europe and to the European Union authorities, I think that would be the most helpful aspect of that. This is our understanding from the side of Amnesty International. We are doing advocacy to the Greek government. We are pushing them. However, we understand that it's very easy to fall into a wall because you will continuously be receiving the answer that yes, but the European Union has this kind of policy and we would like to do that, but we cannot. So the power lies in the European Union authorities.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Gabriel. Yasonos, would you like to add something here or should I proceed with the next question? Yes? Unmute yourself.
Yes, I would like to make a small comment. I completely agree with Gabriel that it's only a matter of political will that Moria is in this shape. And in my opinion, the strategy of Europe is common, is shared among the member states regarding the external borders. And if we can summarize it, it's like make the lives of refugees as horrible as it gets in order to deter them from coming. It's a policy of deterrence. And deterrence in the central Mediterranean Sea is achieved by letting the people drown, because they are literally letting the people drown. They are confiscating rescue ships, they're persecuting rescuers, they are not sharing the distress calls, they have stopped doing search and rescues, they are funding the Libyan Coast Guard to return migrants back to the slave markets of Libya. And the deterrence in Greece is achieved by confining them in the hell-like camps of the Greek islands. So it's a strictly political decision to keep these camps in such horrible conditions. Moria is not an accident. Moria, it's a well-designed European policy for asylum seekers. That's why all European countries are reluctant to take even one refugee from the islands, even though everybody knows that the burden for Greece is disproportionate compared to the size and the wealth of other European countries.
Thank you, Asonas, for this comment. Maybe wrapping it up a bit. I mean, what preceded, so to say, the EU-Turkey deal, the few months before it was signed, was the so-called closing of the Balkan route, particularly in Austria. This was the big political game of Kurz, who is also still the governor, but also a big political game in many Visegrad countries that refused consequently to support this redistribution mechanism, so to say, proposed by the European Union now the last 3 years, on and on all the time. But what we have to keep in mind is that at the end of the day, the numbers tell us that not even that work. I mean, the Balkan route never closed. In a different, but in a sense, similarly precarious condition, like the people in Moria are the people right now in Bosnia, in Serbia, or at the Croatian border, but it also concerns the people in Calais, and all the non-official camps around Europe. What I do think that is very important not to forget, again, is to be able to recognize the hypocrisy, particularly when we start talking about human rights on, let's say, a high European political level. I just want to remind everyone again, I mean, it was only 2016 where some politicians were saying, shoot them at the border, and you had hundreds of thousands of people protesting that kind of requests or demands. And here we are 2020, 4 years later, and people were actually shot at the border, and there were actually paramilitary groups operating at the border and so on. And we're also at a point where European externalization camps, like the camp in Libya, it was just a few months ago where the actual war, the civil war going on in Libya, actually engaged around the camp. So I think it's very important how you put the context of the political responsibility in all this, and I hope that we will be able very fast to mobilize more in this direction. Now, to continue our discussion, perhaps you could say there was a question I saw from the audience already asking whether or not people keep coming despite the COVID pandemic. I think this is also a kind of gray spot in the information outside Greece. This will be one question, and another question that I would have is how can people not being within Greece right now in this situation where volunteers and activists cannot move to the islands to support physically, how can they support the work on the ground in Greece? And yeah, let's start with this and we will continue.
Okay, it is true that the arrivals are not so high in the Greek islands in the last period of time, and because most of the refugees during the Evros event, most of the refugees were gathered only at Evros border. I mean, the agreement between the European Union and Turkey is only about the Greek islands. It's not about Evros. So even though there was a huge dispute that Turkey is violating the agreement, we have seen over the last 2 weeks that the Turkish Coast Guard is actively intercepting boats in the Aegean and returning them back to Turkey. So things are back to normal in the Aegean Sea. Greek Coast Guard and Turkish Coast Guard, they're both intercepting boats. So the arrivals have dropped almost to zero the last 10 days. Of course, the spread of the pandemic is another reason, because Turkey is on lockdown, and this is another reason why arrivals have dropped significantly. But the problem is that as we are talking right now, we have 90 refugees in Lesbos that are sleeping outdoors. They are left to stay on the beach in Petra and in Palios. They are staying in the open ground because the police is afraid to touch them before the 14 days of quarantine. So the authorities imposed a quarantine at the place of the boat landing. It's crazy. We have babies and families who are sleeping out in the open without even a tent, because the mayor of Petra and the locals of Petra didn't want to give them tents, and they were sleeping under the rain. They just covered themselves with pieces from some old refugee boats. It's crazy. The images from Lesbos are unbelievable right now.
Thank you, Iasonas. Gabriel, would you like to add something?
Yes. I was also looking now at the data. It's they are zero. We have zero arrivals in the last days. There were a few more in before that, but they are very small arrivals from Turkey, and they can be explained in the way that Iasonas said. There was another question from your side, Katerina, on how people. Can you remind me a little bit the question? Sorry, it was.
I mean, perhaps it was too much to put it in one. My question was, now in this situation where we more or less the biggest space that we have is the digital space, so to say, and we're restrained from traveling to Greece, from helping out on the ground, how people can get active, and how we can stay connected.
Yes, these are new challenges for all of us. However, we shouldn't underestimate the power of social media and the power of digital in nowadays. I don't want to advertise what we are doing as Amnesty. We are running a petition, a campaign, a global petition towards the Greek Prime Minister. But I'm sure that it's not the only one that people could sign and send to the Greek Prime Minister in the middle of the COVID crisis, and try to highlight this issue. As far as I know, this is not as far as I know. There have been taken some initiatives from various NGOs here in Greece, and with also the participation of NGOs from other countries as well. And they have sent a letter towards the Greek government and to the European Union authorities in order to press to take measures in order to secure the people from COVID-19 in the islands. And I think that because social media actually are a new public space, actually, this is what they are. So all the digital activism and what people can do would be really important in nowadays. I am happy to tell you, as far as it concerns Greece, because I know the data. We started this campaign as Amnesty on Friday. We launched our petition here in Greece from Friday and until Sunday night, without putting any money on Facebook and social media yet for that petition. It had already about above 2,000 signatures, which is very good in terms of the general climate. But now we're gonna push it more in order to get more. However, this is an index for us that we see that even under these difficult situations where everybody, all households live in abnormal times, there are, however, the reflects from the side of solidarity people and human rights people to understand that there are some people that are more vulnerable than others. And obviously it's not only refugees and migrants. There are so many categories in every society, in all of our countries, that there are people who are very much exposed to risks much more than we are.
Thank you, Gabriel. I think this is very important. And I think a big part of our job in the coming days will be to try to remind to people that human rights either are valid for everyone or for none. I'm repeating this, keeping again into my mind the discourse here in the Central and Northern Europe that more or less reduces, so to say, the fight to human rights, let's say, to what can be politically acceptable in this particular political circumstances. Meaning, for example, I have to be very honest with you, I was very angry when I saw different petitions that solemnly asked the evacuation of children and women, because by doing so, yeah, by saying that women and children are, so to say, the less of the danger, you're practically reinforcing the far right narrative that says young men, refugees are dangerous and they should be kept away, right? So there was this one problem there, and of course a question that is that has been coming up a lot is, why aren't the empty hotels used for these people for now, at least for these times of crisis? I mean, tourism, Greece has quite a big tourism infrastructure in terms of buildings and bathrooms. There should be capacity. So again, it's scary. The very thought that it is a deliberate decision not to evacuate these people should be worrying for everyone. I think we're quite good in time, and I would ask Tatiana, I see that we have already 14 questions in our Q&A box.
Sorry, if I can add something regarding the previous question.
Yes, yeah, of course. Yes, please go ahead.
Okay, yeah, the question what to do is always relevant, I think, in every context. It's the most, omnipresent question of the solidarity movement. But I think that every person can act also from their country, because for me the most important thing right now is not money, is not sending items to Lesbos, but to put political pressure for the evacuation. And this can happen only if we have a coordinated effort in all European countries. That's the thing. Of course, petitions, and I know that we have a restriction of movements and quarantine in all across Europe, and an online petition is the first step. But and this is one of the big dilemmas that the Greek movement was facing the last weeks. If it's a matter of life and death, like the the situation in the Greek islands. Will we protest or not? Will we stay in their houses or not? This was an important dilemma, which is still ongoing, because we're talking about 42,000 people crammed in these conditions in the threat of the coronavirus pandemic. This is like, really, again, for me, this sounds like an attempt to mass murder if they let these people under these conditions. So yes, of course, it's more urgent than ever to put pressure to evacuate the islands. Otherwise, we're talking about a potential humanitarian catastrophe. And I agree completely with Katerina. The most realistic option under these circumstances is to rent all these empty hotels and all these empty rooms. We are talking about 30 million of tourists every year in Greece. So there is plenty of room to accommodate 42,000 people. It's just a matter of putting the right pressure to achieve it.
Thank you very much, Iasonos. So Tatiana, would you like to read some questions out for us?
Okay, so I would choose to pose the questions, those that were most voted. So the first one is by, and I'm sorry if I do not pronounce correctly the names, but so the first one is Iro Grimpizzi, who asks if we know if this COVID-19 pandemic has sparked new discussions around the Dublin 6 proposal, so the Dublin resolution on asylum seekers. Connected to this issue of refugees and pandemic, Harris Goulemis finds a little bit astonishing how over 30,000 people in camps have not been detected as sick, not having high fever or cough. And then Alia Abidi, he asks 1, 2, 3, I think 4 questions, but his questions also got several likes. So I would shoot them all and then you decide what to answer. So the role of the Greek media in this increased attacks by fascists at borders and on the islands, which are the opportunities to advocate access to healthcare for all in Greece, and how much of refugee policies in Greece are dependent on Greek politics and how much is dependent on the European Union. And this would be the first round.
So can you repeat the second part of your question about the healthcare?
Whether or not this is a time to advocate for universal healthcare for everyone in Greece. I would say both of you could answer. Gabriel, would you like to go first? Because I saw you showing your hand.
No, yes, of course. First of all, the first question by Iro, if there is if there are new discussions sparked by COVID-19 about Dublin, from what we know so far is that there is no direct effect or impact of COVID-19 on these discussions. However, what is really interesting is what were the discussions that were taking place before COVID-19. There was a lot of activity because, as you people may know, it's that Germany is taking the presidency of the European Union in the second semester of in the second semester of 2020, and as it seems Merkel wants to have a new kind of European migration policy. And from what we understand and from what we have heard from our colleagues in Germany, but also from some documents that have been leaked from the Ministry of Interior in Germany. As it seems, the European Union is moving forward to a migration policy that actually resembles very much to the way that the Greek government implemented its own policy a few months ago. Actually, a few months ago, the Greek government passed a new law that was actually reflecting its priorities on asylum. And from what all of us understood is that that new law, which was in the very margins, and it was even violating the EU, the community law, the EU law, and also obviously the international human rights law, was in agreement with other European governments and the European Union authorities. And it was actually operated as an experiment, as a laboratory, again, Greece, in order to test this kind of policies for Europe and then try to expand them in Greece and then expand them to Europe. The priorities were first of all, restriction of the right to asylum, to make it much harder to be able to apply and to make the application for asylum, and at the same time have possibilities of getting accepted and recognized as a refugee by forming some safe third country lists, by doing profiling of the people from the countries that they are coming from, and all that. This is the first. The second is detention, keeping people in closed centers as if they are criminals. And this is the new a new aspect of the Greek migration policy, and it will become, as it seems, new aspect of the European Union policy as well. And the third is has to do with monitoring and controlling the borders, which is by enforcing all these things that Iasonas also was saying before, which is actually we have seen this kind of policy, especially in the central Mediterranean with Salvini and all that, but we also have seen it throughout the last months in the Aegean with the Greek Coast Guard and Frontex pushing back boats from Turkey. So these are the aspects, and this is, as it seems, the new kind of European Union policy for migration. So as it seems, of course, there are going to be some kind of mechanisms, voluntary mechanism of relocation and resettlement, but obviously they are not going to help very much. This is the new idea that will replace Dublin, as it seems, according to what is being discussed right now in Europe for the second semester, when Germany will take over the presidency of the European Union. Now, for the second question of Harris, yes, obviously, it's you're very right on asking that. How is it possible, especially when these people live in tents and in the winter under the rain, and when there are vulnerable people, babies, and people with not the appropriate clothes in order to protect themselves from cold and rain. Yes, obviously we have a very serious situation over there, and that's why we are putting the most pressure that we can, and we hope that something will happen about these people to defend them. And the last question. Sorry, I'm trying to find it in order to read it.
It was about fighting for universal healthcare in total.
Yes, obviously, universal healthcare. There was a law passed in Greece in 2016 that it was talking about universal healthcare about all people, either they were insured or uninsured, and that was a progressive law, I have to say, and this is recognized also from human rights organizations because it was actually giving full access to the social right of health to all the people, no matter if they were insured or not, no matter if they were Greek or not, no matter of anything. The big problem in this situation was whether the Greek state had the resources in order to support this kind of laws, because it is one thing to make the provisions in the law, and is a different thing in order to be able to support the provisions of the law in real life. Because after the crisis, after the memoranda, after the austerity policies that have been imposed on Greece throughout the last 10 years, we've seen the budgets on healthcare being diminished year by year. And if we make the comparisons in terms of various indicators on the healthcare system before the crisis and today, that we need it even more than ever within the pandemic, we see comparisons that are very discouraging. So it's one thing to talk about the provisions in the law on full access and free access to all on healthcare, and it's another issue to give the resources in order to materialize this full access. The role of the
in this moment, you can tell us a little bit about how doctors in Greece actually reacted to this 2019 change, because I think for our audience is also important to understand that that not all doctors comply to the law always. So there is a.
You mean about refugees and their access, the AMCA story, and yes, obviously. I haven't heard of a lot of cases that they have complied. I don't know if there are cases of that doctors have denied to a person who had this kind of problems to have access to healthcare. We know, as Amnesty, we know a lot of cases of people, various situations. We had been following a case of an African woman who had HIV, and she was in the hospital, and she needed to take all these antiretroic treatments, which are very, very expensive, and that she entered the hospital for another reason, because she was bitten or something like that, and the doctors treated her over there, and they found that she had HIV, and they had a big problem because they could not let her leave, because otherwise she wouldn't be able to take the treatment for HIV if they let her go outside the hospital. She was physically good, and they were keeping her inside the hospital in order to give her the medication on free. There are many cases that the doctors themselves and the personnel in the hospitals have put themselves in front of this kind of crazy situations. I mean, it's not easy for anybody to be asked when he or she is a doctor not to give medication or not to give treatment to people who are vulnerable and need to be treated. But I have talked very much. Yasunas.
Thank you. Yasuna, go ahead. Please take the floor.
Yeah. So mostly I agree with what Gavril said. I would like to just make some comments on the first question. That I think that one of the main narratives of almost every European government is the idea of migration containment. The newly elected Greek government, it was one of their main slogans as well. We will set up closed prison facilities on the islands. We will immediately deport every migrant. It was one of their main key slogans. So we have, I mean, globally, we see political figures that they rely their whole political campaign on the war against migrants and refugees. Salvini, Trump, Orban, Johnson are some examples. And I think it's true that most political parties in Europe invest on xenophobia as a way to gain more audience, because at the moment they have nothing else to offer. We are living in an economic period of austerity, of an ongoing mild recession. People are disappointed from the political system, the politicians. So the notion of national security is gaining ground. Unfortunately, nationalism is still very strong nowadays, and it's really worrying and concerning because historically speaking, nationalism and racism, they created the largest cemeteries the world has ever seen. So it's it should concern us all, because it's not a matter of, as Gavril said before, whenever someone is targeting the migrants, all this racism and all this hatred will be fueled against others who are less privileged in the near future. So the notion that some lives matter more than others is the ground where fascism is growing. And it's true that the figure of the migrant is presented as the enemy, the threat, the invader, the terrorist, thus justifying and normalizing the worst kind of violence against them. And this is something that the societies will be affected, because all this, the hatred against the weak is something that affects all of us.
This is, thank you for this comment. Maybe we pick it up from there before letting Tatiana read the next questions. There was a question about media and how the media coverage has fueled these attacks or not. I think what you said right now is quite important. I mean, there have been, I welcome everybody to check out the site of the United Nations. They're even issued special papers on how the migration has been covered. I just to have the comparison, which I see very evidently also here in Austria. 2015, everybody named this mass exodus from Syria as a refugees crisis, right? And at the end of the day, in this particular time, we saw civic society all over Europe responding positively. What actually made it to a migration crisis was when the government started closing one border after the other. And this is where the crisis modus actually broke out, but not for us, rather for the refugees that were let alone to their own destiny. Particularly the way that language is used to fuel the dehumanization of people coming from outside Europe is abundant in almost every political debate in any country of the European Union, but also extensively any country of Europe. There are real big networks of internet trolls, blogs, warning that our civilization is going to be alienated, that there has been a lot of politicians putting migrants and refugees in relation to the COVID-19. And this happened also in Hungary, for example. Hungary also suspended the right to asylum just a little bit after Greece. And just today, they suspended the parliament. As of today, the function of the parliament in Hungary is suspended. So we see that there is a tendency by illiberal leaders, so to say, to use these situations, crisis situations that create fear and where information is missing, to push for their own agenda. Now, I would like particularly to discuss a little bit with you this correlation between COVID and migrants and refugees, because we've seen it spreading very fast. Also Kurz here in Austria, at least before the pandemic spread in Austria, he was literally referring to migrants and refugees coming now in. And right now, we know, we can say it's well documented, the spread of the virus in Europe was actually rich regions and rich Europeans traveling around going on skiing holidays. So we see this discrepancy between reality and what people think. So I guess a big part of our work would be to continue informing people about the actual facts. Perhaps you want to say a couple of words on that, or maybe how COVID migration in Greece was discussed before the situation escalated.
Yeah, Gavril, you want to start, or I don't know?
Yes, Sonas, go. You do.
Me, okay. Yeah, I think that the way the media covered the coronavirus threat, it was pretty much the same way they are covering any issue that has to do with something coming from outside. So at the beginning, they were demonizing China, like, oh, there was a lot of hatred against China, these weird people, they eat wild animals, all that stuff. And then they started using it as a way to attack migrants and refugees, and giving them making it easier to take more hardline measures against them. I remember specifically on the national TV, I remember a specific program saying exactly that the virus will come from Turkey, where it will come by boat with the migrants, because Iran is one of the epicenters, and Afghani people live in Iran, and we have 80% of Moria people are Afghanis. So they were doing this correlation, and they were seeing refugees as a potential threat for public health. So refugees are always a threat. They're either terrorists, or they steal our jobs, or they bring diseases. Also in Italy, I remember that the first quarantine imposed on ships, it was about the rescue ships. The Sea-Watch and the Ocean Viking were the first two ships that they were forced to stay docked for 14 days at a period where all the other ships of Italy were moving freely. It was crazy. So we see that all the time that they are trying to use any means necessary available to promote xenophobia, to promote racism, and take more harsh measures.
Gabriel?
Yes. What I was thinking is, because there have been so many developments throughout the last 1 month and a half, that we have started forgetting things that have taken place within it, which is very funny if you think about it. It's been like ages since we had the Evros border crisis. So it's very funny, in brackets, that here in Greece, we have actually, according to the media, survived, and still surviving, I hope, 2 wars within 1 month. We had the war, it was a war climate, literally war climate, when with the situation in the Greek-Turkish borders in Evros, the people here and the media and the people thought that we were in a real war situation with Turkey, that the war had started, and the weapon that Erdogan was using were these people, refugees and migrants. And this was also included in the declarations, the official declarations from the side of the Greek government, not only from some, silly ministers, but also from the side, the very official lips of the government spokesman and the Greek Prime Minister himself. And when this after a while, I remember myself in the end of the first week of the Evros developments, the first one who talked about the COVID, the connection between COVID and refugees, was the government spokesman, Petsas. He talked in a briefing that he was doing to official briefing that he was doing to the journalists. Oh no, actually it was in the morning TV show, popular TV show, where he spoke about that, and all of us were quite shocked at the beginning. Me personally, I was shocked because I didn't believe that he would use that he himself as the government spokesman, as the official line of the Greek government. And after 3 days, there was a cabinet meeting, president chaired by the prime minister, where the prime minister also repeated this kind of rationale. So yes, there was a lot of misusage from the side of the Greek government, and obviously from the side of the media as well. Let's be honest about that. Nobody says that it wouldn't be possible that also refugees could have COVID. COVID doesn't make any distinctions between who is refugee, who is rich, who is poor, who is a worker, who is a capitalist, who is everything. It could have happened, and the fact that we didn't have this kind of incidents was a matter of luck. It wasn't something that couldn't have taken place. However, as it seems, there were not this kind of incidents, at least from people arriving. And now the big threat is what's going to happen in the islands. To be honest, I worry very much because there is a big silence on this issue right now. I haven't heard, I haven't been hearing anything about this kind of connection for a long time, and this is a bit worrying, to be honest. As I said in the beginning, it's an obscure situation, and it's very difficult to have a provision in data of what is happening in the islands. At least there are not official data of people having COVID in the islands.
Thank you, Gabriel. Tatiana, would you like to? We have another 20 minutes left. I would like to leave 5 minutes for the end for some closing remarks. So I guess we can take a couple of questions more. Would you read some out for us, please?
Okay, so well, there will be questions that will remain unanswered. I'm sorry, but I would focus on this. So many of the questions regard what can we do, which type of actions can be taken. Alex Nikolic is very bold and he asks, what can we do? Straight ahead, I suppose individually, as activists, collectively, at the European level, the institutional European level, but possibly outside the institutional part of it. So Ana Souza, she wraps up a little bit all the questions around this, and she asks, how can we as citizens press the European Union institutions on the refugee situation nowadays, and how can we act both individually and collectively? Other two questions that pop up were related to the decree on the suspension of the right to seek asylum that Yasonas was speaking at the beginning. And Galina Maximovic, she asks whether is there any international institution capable and willing to oppose this decree. And Alma Stankovic, she further adds, whether are there any plans to challenge these decree in courts, especially with the view to take this all the way to the European Court of Justice?
Thank you very much, Tatiana. Iason, and then Gabriel, I would say.
Okay, regarding the first issue, I said it before and I will repeat it, that for me, the main, the best thing to do at this period is try to apply as much political pressure as possible outside the embassies of Greece, for example, in Europe, outside the European offices, with one main demand, that refugees from the Greek hotspots have to be immediately evacuated, and they have to be transferred to a place where they can implement social distancing, because you cannot implement social distancing when they live 6 people in a 2 square meters area. It's impossible. So, and there are so many solutions regarding this. The practical solution is not the problem. The problem is the political will. It's crazy that the whole world is canceling events and they're imposing fines if we go out to run by ourselves, and they're letting 42,000 people in these conditions. For me, it's a terrible crime, and it should be one of the first targets of the solidarity movement globally.
Thank you. Gabriel, can you take over?
Yes, of course. I agree. I personally, I'm not here to give you specific guidance on what kind of actions people should take up in their countries. However, the field is European capitals. It's not only the European Union, it's your countries as well. And this is something that is very much needed in order to change this kind of attitude, this kind of mentality that sees these people as enemies, as weapons, as invaders in the European continent. What I really think is important is to break this moral panic that we are into in Europe, because it's very difficult it's very easy actually to understand that we are living in a case of moral panic when we see the numbers of the people, of the refugees, of the asylum seekers who are in Europe right now, comparing to other much poorer areas in the planet. It's very easy for somebody to see the data in the UNHCR database and make the comparisons. If you see, for example, how many people are in Lebanon, in Uganda, in Kenya, in so many countries, in Jordan, areas in the world, in Bangladesh, and in Myanmar, if we see what are these areas and how many people they have, it is impossible not to think that Europe right now is one of the most prosperous regions in the planet, and it's dealing not actually with any crisis, because it's not a crisis. It's dealing with the same thing that is happening years and years over and over, that there is a movement of people, and this is how history actually is written throughout the years, with people moving from one country to another. So we have to break this kind of moral panic and put the data down, show to the people that we have nothing to be afraid. And actually what is really needed is to press the European countries and the European authorities to take over responsibilities towards international law and human rights law, and at the same time implement integration policies, because this is something that we haven't talked about, and for me this is one of the most important issues here in Greece as well, because we are talking very much about the need to reformulate the Dublin regulation, as if we believe that all these people will go to Europe and we will get rid of this burden here in Greece. This is not the case. We have to try to learn to live with these people. And in order to do that, we need integration policies in Greece and in other countries as well. Integration policies are not a pull factor. Integration policies are a way to make the living of the domestic population and of refugees population more humane in a mutual beneficial way. So there are also some other questions that have been addressed. If I remember correct, there was this question about if there are gonna be any appeals to the European Court of Human Rights. I suppose this is about the suspension of Geneva Convention. I suppose, yes. As far as I know, there are some movements from the side of civil society in Greece and from NGOs doing strategic litigation on issues like that. So I suppose who have been very active. The point and the tricky part is that you need to have a very good case in order to go to the European Court of Human Rights. Otherwise, you will create a bad historic, δεν ξέρω πώς λέγεται το δεδικασμένο. Precedent. Okay, so this is the most tricky part, that you have to get to have a very good case, very well justified, and be able to defend this case in the European Court of Human Rights. As you remember, there was a very bad decision from the side of the European Court of Human Rights referring to Spain and the pushbacks that were thought to be legal from the European Court of Human Rights. Of course, there were some specific conditions. However, this shows us that we have to be very careful when we go to the European Court of Human Rights. Why was the allowance suspended? I see there is another question here. As the minister said, we're talking about the allowance of the European Union actually was giving these allowances to refugees. So it wasn't even money of the Greek state. So nobody could say that we were giving our money, the money of the Greek taxpayers, in order to have for the refugees to have benefits. But the Minister of Migration was very open when he spoke in the parliament by saying that in that way we are making it less attractive for these people to come in Greece, because benefits is a pull factor. What they do not understand is that by precluding these people from benefits and by economic and social rights, while at the same time it's very difficult to send them back to Turkey or to their countries of origin, what they do is that they are producing people in a limbo situation. So they will have these people in Greece totally deprived of economic and social rights, living in the margins, being without papers, which is something very difficult for them and their families. So it's like they are pushing these people to the margins. So I'm really afraid that we will see a lot of problems out of this policy, because when people want to survive and find a way in order to survive, they will find other networks as well. So this is very, very dangerous, the way that these policies are supposed to be working as a way to alleviate the pressure.
Mm. Thank you, Gabriel. So people, we're running, we have 10 minutes to the end. I would say you take the space to make some closing remarks and maybe leave me 3 minutes at the end to close our session, okay? Would you like to add something? Do you feel that something hasn't been addressed until now? Or Tatiana, is there a question we have left out until now?
Yes, still in this issue of taking action, there was an interesting question that I accidentally left out. It's about whether currently, are there any other EU countries willing to accept refugees?
Maybe there you can speak as well, but I can tell you at least that there was even this discussion in Germany of evacuating 100 children, like I mentioned before. But even this has been put on hold since the COVID pandemic broke out. But I don't know. Maybe Iasonas and Gabriel are more informed than me in this. Your microphone. You have to turn it on.
Okay.
Yeah.
No, it's who is speaking? Me or Iasonas? I don't know.
Gabriel, go on.
I'm not gonna say a lot of things. It's that it's very funny because we hear a lot of good intentions, and when we hear about real numbers, it's sorry, it's very funny when you see the real numbers. For example, we were listening for countries asking to take 50 unaccompanied minors or 100 unaccompanied minors, which is nothing, totally nothing. It's like a drop in the ocean. You will not alleviate any problem from Greece. You will not. Okay, obviously you will help these people, but these are not a way of an integrated policy in order to manage the situation. So what we see is mostly a statement of intentions. However, we see that it happens in a very limited way, and sometimes it's not happen at all, even it was stated.
Before Iasonas takes the floor, perhaps also for our audience, I mean, there was this change in Portugal, for example. Portugal is probably the only good example right now when it comes to managing these problems. They decided to normalize, to give papers to all the people with pending asylum cases. Not everybody is included in these laws, but at least it's a direction saying, okay, we're going to help these people to find a way into our institutions in order to include them in our way of life. Do you think something like this is possible in Greece in the also in the next in the coming time?
Can you repeat the question?
I was just saying, like, giving the example of
Portugal. The Portuguese example, yeah.
Something even close can be reality in Greece, in Italy, or in other countries.
Yeah. Okay, regarding the previous question, which is kind of connected with this one, I believe that the European countries on their own will not do anything to jeopardize the notion and the scheme of Fortress Europe. And I will give an example. We remember Karola Rakete, the captain of the rescue ship Sea-Watch 3, which was blocked by Italian Navy ships for 14 days at sea. She was stranded at sea with only 53 migrants on board. 53 people were stranded at sea for 2 weeks. And we had around, I think, 100 cities of Germany asking, making the petition that we want the people, send the people to us. And they were ready to rent coaches, send the coaches all the way up to Sicily and take their people in Germany with their own expenses. But the Ministry of Interior of both Germany and Italy, they rejected it. So I think that this policy of Fortress Europe is deeply consolidated, and it can only break through direct actions of solidarity, of the movement of solidarity, of unions, of individuals, of human rights activists, of any kind of progressive people. I think that more or less this is the situation of regarding the fate of the Greek islands. We see some movements to impress, like, for example, I remember that the Pope came to Moria and he picked up 2 families and he left. And he brought them in the Vatican. We see some movements of just to impress the audience, but we have to focus on how to fight this this policy on its very sense.
Thank you, Iasonas. I can only agree with this. I think I will take the time now to close the session. Before doing so, remind everyone what are the 3 immediate things you can do. First of all, stay informed. Staying informed meaning do not only rely on your TV set or on your broadcaster, rely on the channels of solidarity movements, of NGOs, of people that are not willing to give up on human rights per se. So stay informed, take the time, stay connected, which means try to organize, find new alliances, confront the problems that the civic society has had in the past, and try to create broad alliances in order to help our issues. Remember, the evacuation of the camps and the life of these people should be the primary interest for everybody in the next days. On the side of Transform, I would like to welcome everyone for taking part in this webinar. We will continue doing webinars on the situation of migrants and refugees in Europe in the coming weeks. We're planning to do something about Bosnia, planning to do something about Calais, so stay tuned and hope to see you again. To both of you speakers, thank you for taking the time. I know you're both swamped at this moment. Thank you very much. And also thank you to Tatiana and Barbara for facilitating the Q&A and the chat. And I hope we win at the end.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Katerina. And so are we having a final,
yes,
I don't know,
you're having your final thing.
Okay, very, very fast, so Gabriel can have his own. I agree with what you said before, Katerina, that refugees are being dehumanized. And I believe that this fact is shaping the world that we live in. For me, it's like entering a new era. For example, in Italy, we have people facing 20 years in prison for saving people from drowning. In the USA, they persecute people for giving water to refugees. And because a lot of people are asking, what can we do against this reality? For me, in these times where solidarity is being criminalized, where rescue is being criminalized, where the right to life, actually, the right to life is being criminalized, any action of resistance against these policies is crucial. Whether you give a portion of food, whether you block a deportation, whether you rescue someone from the sea, whether you advocate, whether you share the news, whether you provide legal support or raise awareness, there's a million ways to help and to contribute. And I believe that solidarity with refugees is not only a matter that is doing good to them, but it promotes every aspect of our society, because it helps in the sense of developing social awareness, solidarity bonds, deconstructing racism, because historically speaking, societies have been much more threatened and damaged by fascism than by migration.
Thank you very much. And Gabriel, the floor is yours for your last remarks.
I don't have a lot of things to add. My door is ringing, actually. So I totally agree with you. My daughter just came, so it's not very easy for me to continue. Okay, so it was great. I totally agree with all of you. Be strong, be healthy, be safe, and let's all struggle towards that direction. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Yes, thank you. By the way,
thank you very much also for the...
We have recorded the session. Tomorrow we will put it online. We will notify all of you. Thank you very much again.
Thank you
Thank
very
you.
much. Thank you
Thank
very
you.
much for this session.
Bye.
Bye.